Duke William of Normandy must have taken pity on his poor son Robert. He must have seen him trudging around the camps of the French army, his armour pestering all with its constant rattling on account of the straps being too loosely fastened, and his face beset by a most unkingly scowl. Naively imagining that his boy's foul temperament was not permanent, he bestowed upon him a late birthday gift in January 1074. He declared war on the Count of Amiens, Raoul, in order to expand the Duchy of Normandy a little further. Victory was inevitable, so in effect, William was simply adding to Robert's inheritance. It was not the promise of one day ruling Amiens that really gave Robert satisfaction though. It was the humiliation of Count Raoul that he rose to a smirk over. Raoul had been long trusted to lead the armies of the French King Philip. Stealing his lands proved to all that it was House Normandy who were the foremost family in France, and brought Robert slightly closer to hooking puppet strings onto the king's right royal hands. This was the only goal he could pursue in life with any vigour, for it was the only chance for him to make his childhood dreams of becoming royalty himself a reality. Anything less, or anything else, was barely worth getting out of bed for, as Robert made very clear to all who attempted to enter his tent on a summer noon during the 3 years of campaigning he endured to restore the king's control over Flanders. One day though, the tent flap was pushed aside by a man the sight of whom compelled a burst of lacerated chicken to escape Robert's mouth and cover the silken pillows of his daybed. It was none other than his old master, Orderic, clutching in his hands a sealed leather quiver. 10 years after he had been cast out of Le Mans amid a tantrum of Robert the Boy, he returned to dangle a most intriguing document over Robert the Man. Orderic had succeeded in the greedy mission that his foolish boy ruler had once given. He was in possession of a letter signed by the King's Royal Council that bequeathed the county of Vendôme to the firstborn son of William II of Normandy. The paper was fresh, yet the signatories were long since dead, and suitably venerated for the task of giving one last order. Robert wiped the grease from his hands on Orderic's cloak, grabbed the forged claim, and with a barely audible merci through his half-full mouth, he left his loyal chancellor and rushed for his horse. Now that the claim was his, he just needed someone to champion it for him. His father was delighted to indulge his heir, even with a claim as see-through as this one, and not just because of the residue of Robert's greasy fingers. The armies of Normandy were mobilised to attack the Duchy of Anjou for the 3rd time in William's rise to greatness. Robert marched back home with his 700 men, ready to waltz onto a victorious battlefield or into a luxurious siege camp. But something went wrong. The Duke of Anjou, Fulk the Cruel, had raised some 2,000 men, and quickly abandoned his own lands in order to dodge the advance of the Norman main force and intercept the one responsible for this upheaval. Robert's men woke up one morning to a force of triple their number forming up for battle outside the camp. The men looked to Robert. Robert looked at the enemy. Then he looked in the other direction. Retreat! He led his men out of the camp in partial order, trying to look as calm and professional as they could. The Anjou forces waited patiently, wishing to allow their foe to form up properly before an easy yet honourably conducted battle. That would not be the way of it, for Robert lost his nerve and bolted with a few riders to get clear of the field. His men followed his example, and the Anjou force realised that they would have to get a move on to get their loot that day. Some of Robert's men were unable to get to safety. They were slowed by harassing cavalry, and ultimately engaged by charging infantry. Robert did not look back over his shoulder, and did not see 100 or so of his troops killed amid the shambolic rout. Perhaps it would have been more if they did not happen upon the camp of Count Raoul, who had been made to lead the men who had stolen his lands in some cruel twist of fate orchestrated by William. 5,000 Normans peered over at the noisy arrival of Robert's retinue. Raoul was happy to upstage the heir to House Normandy, and sent his men out to save the rest of the main company. Robert left him to it, hurrying his men away in search of his father's troops in Vendôme, and insisting to any that asked that he had been there all along. Raoul must have been lying about the affair with the retreating and the begging for help, as a bitter old count in his position surely would. The story fit with one of Robert's earlier lies about being involved in a big battle over in Rheims during the Civil War. That must be where he lost all those men. With the story laid straight, now Robert just needed to wait for his father's 8,000-strong host to finish the job. There was actually some fighting in Maine when the Angevins tried again to make an example of Robert's people, but Duke William stamped that out on Robert's behalf. Robert rode up to the battle several hours after it started, and was allowed by William to have a go commanding the centre. He had glorious fun, ordering his overwhelming force to smash through the surviving enemy ranks, and partook of the noble sport of peasant jousting with his father. Their heart-warming laughter, just audible over the screams, would have made Duchess Matilda very happy were she there to see it, and not busy running the Norman court while the boys did their thing. Their thing was done, Fulk surrendered, and Robert was named Count of Vendôme. 14 years of hard work had finally got him something. The tiny county next door, a mere fifth the size of what he already owned. His father had given him another gift that, in retrospect, was found to be utterly insulting. The Norman army could easily conquer all of France, Robert reminded himself constantly. His father's generosity was surely just a ploy to stop him from rising to true greatness. Was it his royal marriage? Was it his rapport with the High King of France? Was it his dazzling command of the tavern wenches with his bawdy tongue and keenly memorized rude poems? Perhaps all three. Suffice to say, when a delegation from the freshly usurped land of Vendôme came to visit their new leader, offering him a chance to sponsor a festival as a sign of his goodwill, he cast out those beggars with a rasping refusal. The people of Vendôme learned well Robert's leadership style. He offered the choice between leaving him alone or facing his arbitrary angry rulings. Like the people of Maine, the grumbling peasants of Vendôme did their best to manage on their own. Orderic, the man behind the recent upheaval, was soon rumoured to be dining with the nobles of Anjou proper, trusted again by Robert to orchestrate the further downfall of Duke Fulk. Feeding the ambition of a jealous count was hard work, but Orderic would rather weave schemes than sit at his lord's spittled side in court. It was finally time to relax again, which for Robert meant a welcome change of bed and slightly better food. There was business aplenty to attend to in the realm, but Robert loathed to preside over the court, especially not in the morning, so most days the Hall of Le Mans was barred and empty. Unfortunately for him, not everyone knew of this unwelcoming arrangement. One afternoon he had claimed the hall as his private domain for the carrying out of a most arduous noble duty, seeing that the amorous low-born courtiers had their fill of their betters. Before the day's work was done, a bold city mayor threw open the doors and strode into the hall. Robert coughed out a grape, shooed Madame Adeline away from his throne, and casually crossed his legs. With a raised, broken voice, he asked the mayor to remain in the doorway for the purposes of their conversation, some 10 meters back and slightly below the height needed to truly confirm the state of affairs in and around the throne. The mayor briefly shouted his pitch about lower taxes in recently conquered and looted cities, and Robert nodded with remarkable enthusiasm. Of course the mayor would have his wish, if only he would close the door and his mouth. The next day, the nobles of Maine were shocked to see Robert had taken a sudden, deeply keen interest in this particular matter, and gladly accepted his proposal for an amendment to the law, if only to encourage the Count to bring more issues before them. They didn't see him again for a long time. Court was finally held properly a few months later, apparently in order to discuss fulfilling a sweet-nothing promise Robert had made to get Madame Adeline married into a noble family. Was this better than no government at all? The debate raged among the courtiers as Robert laughed and murmured to Adeline in the corner, with his eyebrows scarcely lowering. Interrupting the futile course of affairs was the arrival of Orderic with a group of travelling knights. What business he had conducted with them was beyond Robert's care, but it was insisted that they be allowed to join the court and dine with them as guests. Robert waved his hand in response and left Orderic to interpret the signal as he wished. The knights stayed and competed with their local counterparts in a friendly combat tournament. Robert glanced at the proceedings a few times from his window, but his interest in fighting had dulled after spending years at war and discovering how truly boring real warfare was. In the evening, he took a stroll with Adeline into the grounds, indulging her endearingly annoying obsession with collecting fallen leaves to use in broths she would never make. Orderic intercepted them, walking with 3 companions, 2 of which held up the third by the arms. It was a hedge knight wounded in the tourney. Orderic requested that the knight be allowed to stay in the castle until his wounds were healed. Robert looked the burly knight up and down, looked at Adeline, who was definitely also looking the burly knight up and down, and finally produced a handful of coins from his pocket, poured them through the knight's open visor, and informed him that the next lord down the road was into his sort. A clammy slap on the knight's chestplate and a tight-lipped smile for Orderic concluded Robert's involvement in the affair. So life continued on in the pleasant counties of Maine and Vendôme. By spring the next year, Robert was even more vacant from his duties, often leaving the castle to go on long walks, while the meddling Adeline was allowed to conduct business in the Count's name. He had bitten off more than he could chew with her, he was starting to realise. One morning he rode out from Le Mans and did not return. At first, all assumed he was simply absconding from his duties for good, but in truth, he had met on the road a messenger from Rouen, who carried tidings most dire for House Normandie. Duke William had suddenly passed away by afflictions unknown. The military genius, who many had foreseen as a king, was gone. What was to become of House Normandie now? Robert knew the answer. It was to become his. With matters of mourning and honouring the achievements of William quickly seen to, Robert was bequeathed a new barony, the capital county of Rouen, and of course, the title of Duke of Normandy. It was not the title he had wanted to inherit from his father, but now that he finally had it, it felt undeniably good. So good that he was able to smile through the news that William's will had elevated his younger brother Richard to the rank of Count. Robert was now head of the house and the leading duke in all France. What was more, the Pope's recognition of William's claim to the throne of England was applicable to him as the direct heir of the claimant. He needed only to raise enough troops, and a just conquest of England would be his prerogative. And why use his own troops, good as they were, when the troops of his good friend the king were still alive and kicking? The scheme to secure control of the king would now enter its next phase.